I have so many mixed emotions about what's going to be happening in Piggy Chapter 10. The secrets are getting better and better, the suspense is rising, and the theories are brewing. So in today's video, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about something that we've been thinking about probably since about Chapter 6, if not before Chapter 6, which is going to bring us into getting closer to Mr. P and TSP. Now, if you don't know who TSP might possibly be, we did a full breakdown on who we think TSP is, and I'm about 90% sure that we were correct. And TSP, the first time we actually start knowing anything about TSP is actually in Chapter 8. But we're gonna dive into some dark, scary secrets here, so prepare yourselves. Also, if you are enjoying the Roblox Piggy videos, if you can, leave a like and share it, and also feel free to subscribe for more, and if you're new to the channel. And if you want to show your further support, make sure to use star code BIGB2 when purchasing Robux. I really appreciate it. So let's go ahead and start with some more Chapter 10 predictions. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to talk about the whole Piggy as a whole. I want to talk about Chapter 1 through Chapter 9. Some of the notes, I won't go through every single note because we pretty much are caught up on the notes. If you haven't been following the prediction videos on the channel, I highly suggest you do that. We also reveal some secrets as well, things you may have missed. We did a full, complete secret review over on Chapter 9, The City, which again, in my opinion, Chapter 9 was possibly one of the best chapters thus far of Piggy. Chapter wise, secret wise, I would say level wise as well was a pretty tough level to actually play and beat. More very challenging, shall I say. So it was a lot of fun. But there were some things that we learned in Chapter 9, things like new characters getting introduced. Ellie, for an example, the grandmother, Piggy, who has a shop and actually left a note in there. It would also make sense, why would we find a note written inside of the grandma's shop unless it was actually being framed, but I don't actually think so. The theory also is, like, also finding a note inside of the grandma's shop that was written what appears to be by the grandma because it's directed towards George. She says poor George in the Peppa Pig TV show, and in the note it also said poor George. And now I just want to dive into just where we are now. What can we possibly expect? Maybe even not in Chapter 10, maybe in Chapter 12. But right now there is no set into it. It depends on what everyone wants. So let's say Minitoon says that, you know, it's going to stop at Chapter 12. That's going to be the end. Although I think the story is getting really big again. I think I would love to get at least like 20 chapters, especially due to the fact that I feel like the story really started picking up about midway through. I would say about midway through is when it really started getting super deep. So yeah, it would really be cool to see how it would stretch. I think the episodes, like the chapters, aren't really that long either, about 10 minutes each. So I would say I would love to see more chapters in the future, but he also did say that it depends on what everyone wants. If everyone wants it to end at Chapter 12, then it might possibly end, but I do have a feeling that it won't end at Chapter 12. Now, I'll most likely do another video talking about Mrs. P and her whereabouts, where she kind of possibly fits into all of this. But today, I want to talk about a laboratory, I want to talk about Mr. P, and I want to talk about TSP. There's some really cool things that you all pointed out to me that I even missed. So we're going to be going over some of that today. And one thing I want to go over is a note. Yes, we found more notes in Chapter 9 that was written by TSP that we actually read. And there's, you know, little wording in the notes that I also kind of take note to, shall I say, like for reasons that, you know, Mr. P insists, or that was in a note, I believe, and it was either the hospital or it was one of the earlier chapters where it was like Mr. P insists that this actually, you know, is going to work. So, you know, Mr. P was really pushing it that they should really drink these potions. And there was also a note in here which said Mr. P, I think it was something funded by Mr. P. So Mr. P didn't actually create this, but it was also funded by Mr. P, if that makes any sense. So Mr. P is the one that's actually backing this and actually believes in this cure. But wouldn't that make, I mean, you would think that Mr. P would actually have seen results, that the cure actually works. But if, let's say, if we go through the lines of, okay, Mrs. P was sick, we can write that down. So Mrs. P was sick, Mr. P actually finds a cure, but wouldn't Mr. P have given Mrs. P the cure, and then Mrs. P would have turned evil? But therefore, why would Mrs. P also be watching you in Chapter 9 from the window? It just doesn't make sense. So that's something to really kind of think about as well. I think if Mrs. P was infected, I would think she would possibly come after you. If so, or maybe let's say that this infection wears off at some point. Maybe Mr. P also, gave Mrs. P the cure, which is Mademoiselle, gave Mrs. P the cure, and then that aggression phase was also there, and then Mr. P actually left trying to find another cure, but then after a while it kind of wore off. But we have to start thinking about the infected, who's also infected, and has the cure even worked? I'll get into more detail about that too at some point. But yeah, there was a good note, shall I say, in chapter 9, which said, we need to start recruiting soon. Now that means like a group, they're talking about a group. And then the note says, I'll start with my closest friends. And that was by TSP. And one thing you all pointed out was that this note, when he said, I'll start, he's talking about one person. So TSP might actually be one person and not necessarily a group. I know it kind of throws us off a little bit with the we need to start recruiting soon, but I think TSP is talking about as a whole. But as far as TSP writing this note, it is one person writing this note, and it's TSP. So that would only make sense that this is the super potato. A lot of people were also thinking this was the secret patient. Again, who knows, maybe something takes a twist and turn, but for now, I'm sticking with the super potato. And also seeing notes like doggy got what they deserved, and all these other notes that seemed and showed signs of aggression, I would say, by TSP. So my theory is that TSP is possibly framing Mr. P, because it would only make sense. They also are potatoes, they are looking alike, and this is where it's also going to be one massive twist and turn, that Mr. P is actually Mrs. P and the super potato, and it's just one person. But it would make sense that TSP is actually framing Mr. P. I mean, they do look exactly alike. And again, I'm starting to lean more towards that maybe Mr. P is innocent and being framed. That's something to also think about as well. I really have that. I just have a feeling that Mr. P is possibly being framed. I feel like if Mr. P was evil at this point, which I'm not going to completely rule it out, I would also think that they would throw in a very big wrench and just kind of throw it off and just kind of confuse everyone. I think it would be too obvious now if Mr. P was just evil, but we'll just have to see. And again, with the news of the cure going around, and it said it was funded by Mr. P, hope all goes well. Again, things like that, like the notes are revealing things bit by bit, but I would not be surprised if TSP is framing Mr. P. Now, we also have to think about a laboratory. I think we're definitely going to get a laboratory map between this chapter. If it's not the next chapter, part of me is thinking the next chapter might be either the sewers or a laboratory. I'm definitely thinking we're going to get a laboratory. I mean, when you think about the potions being made, we did have some in the hospital, just the two. I thought we were really getting close to that. Like, oh, I think these, the cure was made in the hospital. But I would definitely think that Mr. P has a laboratory. I wouldn't be surprised if there's a chapter called Mr. P's Lab. That would be amazing. Like right now, if you think you would love to see a chapter 10 Mr. P's lab, let me know down below in the comments. I think that would be awesome, because the experiments have to be going on somewhere. It has to be a backstory to how this cure, quote unquote, came about. Where did this actually come? Who actually created this? And this is something that's not just created in, Peppa Pig's family house or in the basement. I mean, I still think someone is buried under house in the basement, but this isn't something that's made down there. This is something that's made in a lab. I mean, we have to think this is being funded, which means it's being paid for by Mr. P and supported by Mr. P. And Mr. P, the hat represents that Mr. P has some cash, okay? Just saying it. No, just kidding. But it's being funded. It's definitely has a lot to do with a lab. So I'm definitely thinking in the next chapter 10, we may see signs of a lab or something that may lead us to a lab. You also all are thinking that as well. So those are my theories on this one. I would love to see a backstory or a little bit more insight to how this was actually made, a lab where maybe they're experimenting on people. You have to think, how are these, potions and infection potions being made? Where is it being made? Who is actually making it? And I think they're still making it and also infecting everyone you pretty much bump into, which I'm pretty sure there's going to be another infected person as well in chapter 10. And we also have to think about George too. I do think George is cured. Again, I have that theory, which we talked about in the previous video, where we think that George is the one behind the dumpster. So that's something to also bear in mind. But what I'm gonna do is I'm going to, as always, read some of your comments and talk about the theories that you all shared. So let's go ahead and get this started. Dat Boy says, theory is, for the testing, it was probably a doctor who was writing the notes since they were in a hospital for testing. So let's pause there. So let's say that, you know, that blackout period that you had where you're hallucinating doggy? What if you went to the lab and then came to the hospital? So who knows how long you were out for? They didn't even answer that. So they continue on to say, the doctor in Peppa Pig is Dr. Bear, who could relate to Barry. He also wrote that he was locked up in a prison cell with crazy monsters on the loose, and that could be Barry's backstory, since he was probably infected by the monsters in the cell. There are also a note in the station where I think he was locked up that said, they can't find me here, can they? So I think that's how Barry became Barry. Pretty good theory there. We have a pretty long theory here by Viral YT, and they said, read this. Okay, so one thing I found out on my own is Bunny was also part of a team who went to look for survivors, because in school, in the room where you free Bunny, there was a paper that says the search for survivors went bad and other stuff. This also means that the TSP does mean the search party, and that Mr. P is targeting the TSP so they can't find the survivors. Also, another thing, in Carnival, where you see Foxy's cage, you see a paper that says, why did my friends leave me here? Maybe his friends are the TSP and locked him in there because he turned infected. Ooh, this is good. But maybe the reason why Foxy doesn't kill you unless you touch him is because he didn't fully turn infected. He might still be in the process of getting infected. Also, another thing, LOL, in the school, inside a classroom, it has a bottle, like a bottle of potion on the desk. That's what the teacher drank to turn infected. Oh, and also I think that the one in the dumpster is Molly the mole, because she doesn't have ears. Please read my comment and put it in the video, like, so he can see it, guys. Edit, also read this. Okay, so over the past hours, I found out so much more about TSP could be the super potato, and that TSP is not Mr. P, and that Mr. P is getting framed. Now, I personally think that TSP is framing Mr. P, but yeah, definitely, yeah, okay. So TSP is not Mr. P, but okay, we're on the same page, Because in Peppa Pig show, there was an episode, and in the episode it showed that the Super Potato and Mr. Potato are two different people. That could be that Mr. P is getting framed and the real bad one is TSP. Because what if the whole time you thought it was Mr. P was TSP? Maybe TSP is the one turning animals infected because Mr. P is the one funding the cure. Ooh, this is good. Because it says on papers, and his wife probably got sick or something, and that's why he's looking for the cure. Just a quick note too, what if, right, let's say that TSP, being that TSP is the super potato and looks exactly like Mr. P, what if he actually disguised himself as Mr. P and infected Mr. P's wife? I mean, this could be very confusing here, but just a thought. John Boy the Gamer says, Shadow Man is Molly Mole. Moles don't have ears, and I know it's her. She didn't come out because she's scared. That's a very good theory there. I'm gonna dive more into that. Brownie Mas 2 says, what if we see George hurt with Doggy saying, help us, Mr. P is after us, and we need to go where they're hurt in the lab and failed experiments to him, and he's trying to kill us and makes us in a new body and curse us. So at midnight, you go to the lab and you save from Mr. P. When you free Doggy and George, you wake up Mr. P and he's a bot and he comes after you and he has Red's eyes and a chainsaw. That's pretty far-fetched, but the lab, Doggy, and Mr. P, maybe not with a chainsaw, that would be really scary, but I think you're along the right lines. Segundo Ramon says, what happens if there's a map and it's a lab and you have 2 cures and you have to pick 2? Well, I think it would be cool if you had to pick 1. So let's say if there was 2 cures, or you had to choose who do you actually save, or let's say there's a scene where you get to TSP and Mr. P, and being that they look alike, maybe TSP is disguised as Mr. P and you have to choose who is the right one. Imagine that. Brooke says, if George hid behind the dumpster in the city the whole time, then perhaps when the rest of his family got infected, he ran out of the lab and went to the city and hid in the dumpster. That's a pretty good theory. Makes sense. Maybe he was running to his grandma and saw that his grandma was sick and then hid in the dumpster. Imagine that. Hank says maybe chapter 10 will be the lab of Mr. Potato. Ooh. Mary Bell Garcia says to lab under the safe place. So there could be a lab under the safe place. Very true. Mark says, my theory is the potato in the picture in chapter 8 was the one in the window, because if you check, he may be checking on George because she sent George to lead you guys to the lab, causing you and Zizzy to be tested on. Ooh, a lot of people are thinking it's gonna take us to a lab. Litter YT says, a theory is, I think that George Pig was kidnapped by Mr. P, and Mr. P takes him to a dangerous lab and turns him into infected. But George Pig kicks his potato face and escapes, and he's being followed. And he follows you in the shadows, and he thinks you work for Mr. P, but you were looking for him, so you did not show, and he was looking for a safe place to hide from Mr. P, and now we meet George Pig in chapter 10. That's what I'm talking about. And then they even put, A, are you crazy? Or do you see behind the dumpster? Let me know. And then they had like a section like A, oh my God, yes, and B, well, not really. And a lot of people chose A, so I'm with you on this. Well, I think that's going to conclude today's video. This was very interesting, and again, I would love to see a point to where, let's say that TSP is the super potato and is disguised as Mr. P, and you have to choose between them. And I definitely think we will get a lab. It is a bit, I don't want to say it's overdue, but I think if we have a carnival, a city, I think the backstory and what would really tie this together is a lab that all these potions were being created, and we can kind of get a backstory on it. Maybe a lab with, monsters or animals being tested on. We just have to see how it's going to go. But I would love to hear your thoughts, feedback, and theories down below in the comments. Also predictions too on, do you think it's going to be a lab? Where do you think it's going to be? Do you think TSP is the super potato? We did figure out that is one person, by the way. And yeah, I would love to hear your thoughts. But thank you all so much for tuning in. If you did enjoy, feel free to leave a like and share it. Also feel free to subscribe for more, and if you're new to the channel, and to stay up to date with the latest Piggy videos. And I will see you in the next one.